My neighbor told me it was just a few screws, just a little piece of metal, just some rainwater, and that I was making a big deal out of nothing. What he didn't realize was that those little screws were drilled into my wall. His little piece of metal was damaging my property, and that rainwater he casually pushed onto my foundation was about to become the most expensive shortcut he ever took. I never wanted a fight with the guy next door. Honestly, I was the kind of person who believed good neighbors were worth more than winning arguments. But sometimes you learn that some people only understand boundaries after they cross them. My name is Daniel Harper, and for almost 20 years I lived in a quiet neighborhood outside Cedar Ridge, Ohio, in a small brick house that was built back in 1967. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't some fancy place you would see in a magazine, but it was mine, and I had put more sweat into that house than most people ever realize. The place was a single-story brick home, about 1,800 square feet, with old copper gutters, a low roofline, and a backyard where I spent countless weekends fixing things that most people would just hire someone else to do. I liked knowing every corner of that house. I knew which floorboard creaked near the hallway, which tree needed trimming every spring, and which section of brick on the west side wall needed extra attention after heavy storms. The previous year, I had spent weeks repairing the mortar between those bricks by hand. It was slow work, messy work, the kind where your back hurts and your hands stay covered in dust for days. But I enjoyed it because I knew I was protecting something I planned to keep for the rest of my life. That wall wasn't just a wall to me. It was proof that if you took care of something, it would take care of you back. The west side of my house sat about 6 feet from the neighboring property line, a narrow strip of grass separating my home from the old duplex next door. That space had been there for decades, according to the original property records from when the neighborhood was first developed. Nothing complicated, nothing controversial, just a simple gap between two homes that allowed both properties to breathe. Then, in January, the duplex was sold. That's when Evan Carter moved in. Evan was a contractor, the kind of guy who bought older houses, renovated them quickly, and sold them for profit. You could tell what he did before he even introduced himself because his pickup truck had his company name printed across the doors in big letters. Now, there was nothing wrong with being ambitious. I respected anyone who worked hard, and at first I actually thought having a contractor next door might be a good thing. Maybe he would improve the place. Maybe the neighborhood would look even better. But after our first few conversations, I started noticing something about him. Evan didn't really have conversations with people. He delivered decisions. Everything came out like he was already halfway through the discussion, and everyone else was just catching up. One afternoon, while we were standing between our houses, I mentioned the drainage setup between the lots. I told him the way water flowed mattered because older homes like mine could have problems if runoff was redirected toward the foundation. He smiled, nodded, and said, "Yeah, no problem. I'll keep everything clean over here." The way he said it bothered me a little, not because the words were wrong, but because he said them like he was reassuring a child, not talking to another homeowner. Still, I let it go. I figured maybe I was reading too much into it. Then a few months later, I had to leave town for a week because of a consulting job. It wasn't anything unusual. I traveled occasionally, and I had never worried about my house while I was away. When I came back, I expected the usual things: mail stacked by the door, a little dust on the porch, maybe some leaves blown into the driveway. What I didn't expect was to see a brand new aluminum gutter system attached to my brick wall. I remember sitting in my truck for a few seconds, just staring at it, trying to understand what I was looking at. Evan had installed a new gutter line along his duplex, but instead of routing the water properly, he had extended it through that narrow space between our houses and fastened part of it directly into my exterior brick. There were fresh holes drilled into the mortar, actual screws, in my wall, and hanging from those screws was his downspout, designed to send rainwater directly onto the ground beside my foundation. It had rained that morning, and I could still see the evidence. Water was pooling near my crawlspace vents. The bricks were dark from moisture. The compound around the screws hadn't even dried completely. It was one of those moments where you feel your stomach drop, not because of the damage itself, but because you realize someone looked at your property and decided they had the right to change it without asking. I walked over to Evan's porch and asked him, as calmly as I could, "Hey, can you explain why your gutter is attached to my wall?" He barely looked up from his phone. He just glanced over for a second and shrugged. "It's just water, man. It's not like it's hurting anything." That sentence stuck with me, not because it was clever. It wasn't. It was because it told me everything I needed to know. He didn't see a problem because he wasn't the one dealing with the consequences. He saw my wall as a convenient place to put a solution. And right there, I realized this wasn't going to be solved by a friendly conversation. So I didn't yell. I didn't threaten him. I didn't make a scene. I simply pulled out my phone, took pictures of every screw, every hole, every drop of water collecting where it shouldn't be. Because sometimes the quiet person in the room isn't the person who's giving up. Sometimes they're the person who is documenting everything. A few days after I took those pictures, I spent most of my evenings sitting at my kitchen table with the documents spread out in front of me. The funny thing about getting older is you start realizing that anger burns out pretty quickly, but paperwork has a way of sticking around. I wasn't looking for revenge. I wasn't trying to make Evan's life miserable. I just wanted him to understand that owning a property doesn't mean you get to quietly rewrite the rules for everyone around you. I pulled out the original property survey, the neighborhood plat map, and the city drainage regulations. I went through everything carefully, almost like I was preparing for a job interview, because I knew if I walked into City Hall sounding like an angry neighbor, nobody was going to care. But if I walked in with measurements, photos, and actual documentation, that was different. The next morning, I contacted the municipal building department and explained what happened. I sent them pictures of the holes drilled into my brick, the angle of the downspout, and the water collecting near my foundation. I expected a long process, maybe weeks of back and forth, maybe someone telling me it was just a civil issue between neighbors. Instead, the response I received was surprisingly direct. The inspector told me that any modification that redirected stormwater onto an adjacent property could be considered a drainage violation, especially if it created potential damage to the neighboring structure. Hearing that was a strange feeling, not because I wanted Evan punished, but because it confirmed something I already knew deep down. I wasn't being unreasonable. I wasn't the difficult neighbor. I was just the person who didn't want someone else's shortcut becoming my expensive problem. 3 days later, Evan showed up in a way I honestly didn't expect. He didn't knock. He didn't call. He simply taped a handwritten note to my front door. When I found it, I stood there reading it twice because I couldn't believe how casually it was written. Basically, he offered to seal the holes, patch things up, and even pressure wash my wall if I agreed to drop the issue. Now, maybe some people would have accepted that. Maybe they would have thought, well, at least he's fixing it. But something about that bothered me. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't him saying, I shouldn't have done this. It was more like he was trying to buy his way out of a mistake. Like the problem was my reaction, not what he had done. I took a picture of the note, put it in my records, and moved on. I wasn't interested in a free cleaning. I was interested in making sure it didn't happen again. By the end of that week, 2 city officials arrived at our properties. One was the building inspector, and the other was a code compliance officer. They weren't dramatic about it. No shouting, no accusations, no movie-style confrontation. They just walked through the space between the houses with clipboards, measuring everything carefully. And honestly, that was probably the part that bothered Evan the most. He was used to being the guy who walked onto a property with a tool belt and told everyone what was going to happen next. But now someone else was looking at his work, and they weren't impressed. They measured the slope of the ground, checked where the water was being discharged, examined the attachment points, and compared everything against the city requirements. Evan stood on his porch with his arms crossed, occasionally making comments about how this was all unnecessary. He kept saying things like, "We're really doing all this over some rainwater?" But nobody argued with him. Nobody raised their voice. The inspector just kept writing notes. And sometimes silence is more powerful than an argument. 2 days later, the official notice arrived. Evan was fined $1,200 and ordered to correct the drainage issue within 10 business days. I remember holding that paper in my hands and feeling something I didn't expect. I didn't feel victorious. I actually felt relieved. Because the whole time, I wasn't trying to beat him. I was trying to get back to a place where my own home felt like my own home again. The 10th day came, and right at 8 in the morning, a city vehicle pulled up outside. A licensed crew stepped out with equipment and paperwork. Evan came outside almost immediately, probably hoping to supervise the situation. But there wasn't much for him to control. They disconnected the illegal downspout, removed the hardware from my wall, and carefully repaired the brick. They filled the screw holes with mortar that matched the original color so closely that, from a few feet away, you could barely tell anything had ever been there. I watched from my driveway, and for the first time since this started, Evan looked different. Not angry exactly. More like someone who had finally realized the world wasn't going to bend just because he expected it to. He muttered something about talking to his lawyer, but the compliance officer simply looked at him and said, "Any further discharge onto this property will result in additional civil penalties." That was it. No argument, no big speech, just a simple statement of fact. And Evan had no answer. A month later, I received another letter from the city. It was a copy of the recorded compliance notice attached to Evan's property records. The violation and correction were now part of the official parcel history, something that couldn't simply disappear because someone wanted to forget about it. When I read that, I realized something important. The biggest consequence wasn't the fine. It wasn't the repair cost. It was the permanent reminder that shortcuts have a way of catching up with people. For Evan, it was a lesson recorded on paper. For me, it was a reminder that sometimes protecting your peace means being willing to stand your ground, even when the other person thinks you're making a big deal out of nothing. And as the seasons changed, the strangest thing happened. We stopped fighting. We didn't become friends. We didn't start having backyard barbecues or waving across the fence every morning. But there was a new understanding, a quiet one. He stayed on his side, and I stayed on mine. And maybe that's all some neighbors need. Not friendship, not agreement on everything, just respect for the line that separates one person's home from another. The morning after the city crew removed Evan's gutter system, I walked outside with my coffee and stood beside that old brick wall for a few minutes longer than I expected. It was strange because, after all the arguing, paperwork, inspections, and frustration, the thing that felt the most satisfying wasn't seeing Evan get fined or watching his project come apart. It was simply seeing my house look like my house again. The wall was quiet. The bricks were dry. The space between the two properties was just a strip of grass again. Nothing more, nothing less. No metal pipe hanging there like a reminder of someone else's decision. No water collecting where it didn't belong. No little voice in the back of my mind wondering if one day I would wake up to find cracks in my foundation because somebody else decided their shortcut was more important than my home. And standing there, I realized something I hadn't understood when this whole thing started. This was never really about a gutter. It was never about a few screws, a little bit of aluminum, or even the $1,200 fine Evan had to pay. It was about something much simpler and much bigger at the same time. It was about respect. It was about whether people still understood that a property line wasn't just a mark on a piece of paper. It was a promise. It was a boundary that said, "This belongs to me, and that belongs to you." And when someone crosses that line without permission, even in a small way, it changes how you see them. I think what bothered me the most about Evan's actions wasn't that he made a mistake. Everyone makes mistakes. I've made plenty in my own life. It was that he never stopped to ask. He never walked over and said, "Hey Daniel, I have a drainage problem. Can we figure something out?" If he had done that, the whole situation could have gone completely differently. I might have helped him find another solution. I might have even recommended someone who could have fixed it properly. But instead, he looked at my wall and saw an opportunity. He saw an easy place to attach his problem. And when I questioned him, his answer was basically, "Relax. It's just water." That sentence told me everything. Because when something isn't yours, it's easy to call it small. It's easy to say something doesn't matter when you aren't the one paying for the consequences. A few weeks later, we had one of the biggest storms of the year. The kind of rain that makes every homeowner listen carefully. The kind where you walk around afterward checking for leaks, puddles, and anything that doesn't look right. I stood near the window watching the rain come down, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel nervous. The water moved exactly where it was supposed to. My gutters carried it away. The ground drains handled the flow. The foundation stayed dry. It was such a normal thing. But after everything that happened, it felt like a victory, not a loud victory. Not the kind where you stand on someone's porch and say, "I told you so." Just a quiet one. The kind where you realize you protected something important without becoming the kind of person you were fighting against. And that mattered to me, because somewhere along the way, I think a lot of people forget that standing up for yourself doesn't mean becoming aggressive. It doesn't mean trying to destroy someone. Sometimes it just means refusing to ignore something that isn't right. Evan never really apologized. I waited for it at first. Maybe I shouldn't have, but I did. I thought maybe after everything was finished, he would come over and admit he had handled it wrong. Maybe he would say, "You know what, Daniel? I should have asked first." But that never happened. And honestly, after a while, I stopped caring. Because I learned that some people don't change because they understand your feelings. They change because reality finally catches up with them. The fine, the official notice, the record attached to his property. Those things probably taught him more than any argument between neighbors ever could. And slowly, I noticed small changes. Evan started checking measurements before beginning projects. He looked at property lines. He asked questions. He stopped acting like every problem had a simple answer that only he had figured out. One afternoon, I saw him outside with a measuring tape, carefully checking the side of his duplex before starting some landscaping work. The old Evan would have already started digging. The old Evan would have figured he could fix problems later. But this time, he was being careful. He noticed me watching and gave a small nod. I nodded back. That was it. No big conversation. No dramatic apology. No sudden friendship. But sometimes peace doesn't come from everyone admitting they were wrong. Sometimes peace comes from people finally understanding where the line is. I still live in that same brick house today. The mortar I repaired years ago is still holding strong. The copper gutters still shine after every storm. The wall that became the center of this entire situation has almost become invisible again, which is exactly how it should be. A good wall isn't something you think about every day. A good boundary isn't something you constantly have to defend. It simply exists because everyone respects it. And looking back, I think that's the biggest lesson I took from everything that happened. When someone pushes against your boundaries, you don't always need to push back harder. Sometimes you just need to be smarter. You need patience. You need facts. You need the courage to say, "No, this isn't okay," even when the other person thinks you're overreacting. Because the truth is, people often test boundaries when they believe there won't be consequences. They assume you'll stay quiet because fighting feels exhausting. They assume you'll let it go because it's easier. But sometimes letting something go only teaches the wrong person that they can do it again. So now I'm curious what you think. Was Evan just a contractor who made a careless decision and underestimated the situation? Or do you think he knew exactly what he was doing and simply expected me to accept it? If you were standing in your driveway and found someone had attached their project to your home without permission, would you have handled it the same way? Or would you have taken a different approach? I want to hear your thoughts because these neighborhood conflicts always look simple from the outside. But when you're the person whose home, money, and peace of mind are affected, the answer is rarely black and white. Leave your opinion in the comments. Share your own experiences with difficult neighbors or property disputes. And if this story reminded you of a situation you faced, send it to someone who understands what it feels like to defend the place you call home. And if you enjoy stories about ordinary people standing up when someone crosses the line, make sure to subscribe. because there are plenty more stories where a simple decision turns into a lesson nobody expected.